So now we have our big star, and it is an honor to introduce him, myself, Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin. He is the United Nations Special Envoy on financing the 2030 Agenda. He's also the former Minister of Investment in Egypt, and for the past 10 years, he served as the World Bank Group Senior Vice President for the 2030 Development Agenda and for the United Nations Relation and Partnership. Dr. Mahmoud, of course, his CV is, is way beyond somebody like me to introduce it, but I think, I don't need to spend much longer since we're running out of time. I'll give the mic to Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin. Dr. Mahmoud.
Well, thank you so much for this generous introduction that may increase the expectations of the rest of the panel and the listeners beyond what I'm going to deliver. I listened really carefully to all of you, and apology that I joined late by a few minutes, but it's one of those very few engagement that one has to take lots of notes, given your great exposure to different things, different backgrounds, and very insightful comments and suggestions. So thank you so much for that. I learned a lot. In the remaining few minutes, I'd like to share with you some reflections on what we are in today and possible directions for a better future if we have really some good collective action in the different areas that you touch upon today. First, I think we need to realize some facts that, well, I totally agree that this current crisis had a kind of a democratization effect, that we are all exposed to it. But definitely the impact of this crisis and its accompanying crises have been really different depending on our initial conditions. The impact on the poor, the underprivileged is huge, and we shouldn't really undermine that. And if you take it just from the basic areas of agreement on how to protect ourselves, the signs everywhere, from developing to developed countries, please stay at home and wash your hands with water and soap. It looks like a simple thing, but if you take into the details, staying at home is a privilege for many people, especially for those who are depending on what they can really get on a daily basis to feed themselves and their families. While many of us can really have that, but many people in the informal sector around the world, and even in the formal sector, with the latest figure coming from the ILO, they started by saying 25 million people are, that was a few weeks ago, are likely to lose their jobs. Then they increased the number to 195, that was 10 days ago. And then the latest figure a couple of hours ago was 300 million people exposed to losing their jobs if this crisis continues further. Staying at home is a luxury, as we know, not just for the fact that people are depending on what they can gain on a daily basis, but the fact that 1 out of 7 people are living in a slum around the world. And if you check the developing countries, that could be 1 out of every 3 persons. So that is the home. And then access to water is a privilege that is denied to 3 billion people around the world. And talking about add soap to the water, if you are recognizing that 780 million people before the crisis were suffering from extreme poverty. So that kind of mix of water and soap is another kind of luxury. So when we are trying to provide our assistance and social protection, either from government or the private sector through some solidarity programs or through the great work the philanthropists are doing and the NGOs, I think this issue of prioritization needs really to be put into consideration. Then we have this dilemma that it's very rarely really to see that protection of life is in contradiction of the protection of livelihood. That is not normally the case. They should really come together. You protect your life, you work, you protect your livelihood. Unless you are in a war zone or in a country that is suffering from civil war. I saw that myself in my previous work and now with the UN as well, in countries which are suffering from conflict. While we don't really have that everywhere, but there are countries which are still suffering from conflict. And we are in this kind of contradiction. If you want really to work, you are exposing your health to some trouble. And if you are staying at home and you don't really have your paycheck coming regularly, you have this challenge. I'm following some interesting guidelines that come from different governors where I'm staying here in the United States. And the best of them I saw came from the governor of Pennsylvania. It's about how we should be data-based when we are opening up, that each community and county need to see the number. If you are less than 50 infected or 50 cases to the 100,000, you can consider opening that. But when you open, there are 5 conditions that could be really very hard to meet when you come to issues related to testing, tracing, and treating. Pennsylvania may have the access, but different places around the world may not. But these are the guidelines. When you close the system, you close it with a hammer. And when you open it, you need to be careful as opening it with a kind of a scalpel, as they say. Having said that, to what extent this kind of a problem that we are living in is basically because of a kind of an external shock, or is it basically at least partially our responsibility? Definitely it is our responsibility. There have been many reports warning the system, including a famous report. If you didn't see it, please have a look at it. It's called A World at Risk, published by an independent panel of scholars, policymakers, including the former Prime Minister of Norway, who used to be the former head of WHO, with her as a co-chair, the Secretary General of IFRC. It's called The World at Risk, and it makes a very nice description that when it comes to epidemics and pandemics, we are between neglect and panic because we are not prepared. And that, funny enough, this panel, if there's anything funny about it, that this panel was established after the Ebola crisis that hit 3 African countries. And that was established by WHO and World Bank to get the lessons. And in September 2019, they said, we are more likely than not, we are going to be at risk of a major pandemic. These guys are not fortune tellers. These guys are scientists and policymakers. So there is an issue here. Yes, you cannot prevent it, but you can really minimize the likelihood of exposure. And here it's not an issue of developing economy or an advanced economy. We can see the great discrepancy, but even within the advanced economies. And I share the comment of the good women leaders and their good management. And I think I don't just attribute it to the women leaders, I attribute it to the societies and communities that elected those women leaders. So it's a reflection of something good at large about the leadership and about the process to elect people based on their merits, not based on their gender or their ethnicity or color. Coming then to the serious action then, what we can really do. Crises have 3 certain dynamics, and I'm more specialized in financial areas, but this is not really a financial one. This is a human crisis more than an economic crisis more than it is a financial crisis. And we need to take it on those 3 levels. Having said that, all crises reveal 3 things, or actually have 3 things. One is revealing factors. They tell us about our weakness and strength. And I think we can really check it from the rediscovery of family and community, which has been always neglected, even when we talk about sustainability and sustainable development. We normally talk about public-private partnership, community, or the great mind of India, Professor Raju Rajan, put it as the 3rd pillar, the missing pillar. I was surprised coming from him. He's a great international macroeconomist. but he focused on this third pillar, another beautiful reference that you may need to check, because it has some serious implications on how to deal with matters. Of course, he didn't deal with this crisis, but he was dealing with the role of community in bridging gaps between government and the private sector, and how can they fix things in a better way. The second dynamic is basically beyond the revealing factors about weakness and strength, is basically the acceleration effect. What we see as we are having our meeting today, this kind of technology was available, but it had only millions of users. Now it has hundreds of millions of users. I hope this kind of access could be for all, but as there are some technological dividends, there is some sort of technological divide. And this is another area of inequality that we may need to be taken care of. And unfortunately, when we talk about poverty and inequality, women suffer more across the board. Check poverty, check inequality. The sufferer will be more from women, and then the younger generation, and the female among the younger generation. So when you are trying to do a corrective action, we need really to deal with that. So beyond the revealing factors of a crisis and the accelerating factor of a crisis, and the acceleration could be positive and negative, the third is basically about the third dynamic, which is about creating new things, which we are not aware of. And some of them could be good and some of them could be bad. But we need to be prepared for that as well. So I like the reference to that we listen to when it comes to some good things, including sustainability, taking SDGs seriously. But we have an issue, because SDGs are very useful, starting with ending poverty as SDG 1 to partnership as SDG 17. And for the good emphasis we listen to in the case of hunger, there is SDG 2 about elimination of hunger. And we already have 820 million people suffering from hunger and 780 million people suffering from extreme poverty. And unfortunately, the initial estimates by Oxfam and others telling us that at least 500 million more are going to be added to that, despite the efforts that we are conducting today. So there is going to be more work needed from public sector, the private sector, and the community-based kind of interventions. But to get out from all of that, we need really to have a good answer to that big question raised in a book by Skidelsky and Skidelsky about, and it has a provocative title, How Much is Enough? Because if we have the resources, but they are not prioritized properly. We have, as mentioned, we don't really have a problem when it comes to food, because fortunately, this year, unlike 2008, 2009, or 2011, we don't really have agricultural crisis or food production crisis. And the fuel prices are at its lows. It's basically the logistical impediments and the incomes that are not that equal that are preventing many people to have adequate access to the necessities like food. So I think in the future, we need really to consider, and with this kind of a big question, how much is enough? And the justice criteria and the solidarity criteria for getting things done, we need really to consider 3 areas of work. Investment in human capital. We saw the price of negligence in one area of human capital, which is health. What will be the implication if we are neglecting the rest, like decent education, quality education, to survive in the new world? We saw the problems in neglecting one SDG, which is SDG 3. It's a reminder that climate change and environment, SDG 13, is Sustainable Development Goals 13, 14, and 15. While I'm seeing the sky nicely from here, I normally see it in Washington, I cannot complain, but I have been really listening to songs of birds that I have never seen. Perhaps I may stay much more staying at home now, but my wife's saying, well, this is new discovery. I've never seen these creatures for many, many years here. But we need really to protect the environment and climate while we are maintaining our work. It's like celebrating having no accidents because there is no traffic. No, we need to have the traffic and prevent accidents. It's like celebrating, I was on the news here, NPR, that for the first time in many, many March months, we didn't have accidents of random shooting by lunatics to schools. Yes, thank you so much, because people staying at home and there are no schools. But we need that to come back without shooting. So how to maintain the decent life while we are resuming the kind of work and life. It will be new life. I cannot say that we are going to be returning to that life that we left before COVID. This is going to be a line of division between what's had been before it and what will be after it. So invest in human capital, invest in infrastructure, including digital infrastructure as well, the DNA, the new DNA, data networks and artificial intelligence. If you don't have a command of them as a society, you will be losing a lot. And finally, investing in resilience, in the climate change. I listened to some comments on that, in the environment, and investment as well in the social protection systems. Unfortunately, not all of the 200 million as of last week, or the 300 million as estimated today by ILO, are going to be returning to work. And we were warning ourselves from the implications of a good thing, which is the fourth industrial revolution, but it may have many victims until they get trained and transit from a job to the other. So you need really to think seriously of how to protect, in a new social contract, the vulnerable, including the young, including the consideration for a universal basic income to deal with that. I know that is being popularized strongly recently, but we need to see, it could be a good idea. We may not take it all, we can take part of it. How to fund it? I think it's again about prioritizing budgets and partnerships going forward. So I think it's one of those meetings and engagements that I have been very privileged to be a listener more than a speaker. And I look forward really to engage with you further, focusing perhaps more, not just on the diagnosis, because most of us can be good at that, but I can see in what you said today, it's not just highlighting a problem, but each one of you, which I'm grateful to you all,